back again with another wonderful installment of the Plague Wizards, and yeah, so here I am. Just realizing, okay, camera one, camera two, but not really. Anyway, so don't really have too much to say tonight to open up. I was thinking about just doing a quick opening, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. So this time I said I was going to actually read read ahead before I started like reading out loud to you guys, but I didn't do that because I don't know. So I'm going to be really careful with what I'm reading. I'm going to try and be slower in my reading. And if I come across something, you'll probably see me stall out and just stare at the page for a little while. And that means I'm trying to rework what is going to be said. Um, Other than that, I'm just going to launch in again because that's what I'm going to do. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into chapter 6. Bear with me. The job was not done in one afternoon, nor even in 2 days, nor 3. At the end of the 4th day, the king's messenger and soldiers, accompanied by the wizards of the other households, had seen every part of Pengua House, from roof to gardens. Royan had considered amusing himself by trying to steer the search past some particular room, claiming it only to be a storeroom for old pots, which could cause them to be more determined to search that room. They would then find that it indeed was a storeroom for old pots. He decided against such an amusement as unworthy of a grandmaster, though, and did no interfering, merely watching the search. He did sometimes find occasion to remonstrate, look in things, peer into them, even dip fingers into them, but please leave them whole. The king's messenger had given him an exasperated look, but did say to the soldiers, "Be a little more careful, will you? Breakage could come out of your pay, you know." He couldn't hide Allison, nor her obviously foreign appearance. When the search party looked into the room assigned to her, he merely said, "This is Allison, a woman from one of the eastern lands beyond Saljashan, come to give us the benefit of her knowledge of plant lore." If he had admitted Allison's true origin, he knew the king's messenger would have insisted on taking her away, to have some of the unbiased wizards test her for every possible kind of danger. She was a guest of Pengua household, and therefore due protection from that sort of thing. Malungtul was happy to see the last of Gurptel's caravan. The man had taken his claim of absolute authority over his train seriously, to the point that those who merely paid passage with him found themselves required to help with various caravan chores, feeding animals, and setting up and breaking camp. Anyone who protested was told they could travel alone, if they wished. Since lone travelers were prime prey for bandits, everyone complied. Everyone, that is, except for those few who paid an extra fee to be free of chores. It wasn't that Malungtul objected to doing work, it was the manner in which it was introduced. There had been no mention beforehand, just that first morning on the trail, Gorwal had pointed to him with the coiled whip he carried, and said, "You! Go help and feed and water the animals." Malungtul looked up at him in amazement. "You paid to join the caravan. You agreed to that on my trail. My word goes. Now I'm telling you to go help and feed and water the animals." There didn't seem to be much use arguing with the man, so he'd gone off to help feed and water the animals. Malungtul was a patient man, but this trip had been a severe trial to his patience. At Goral and the Surad, he went looking for a boatman. Despite the distrust between the two nations, there was still healthy trade going back and forth between Rosthan and Seljashan. Boats were carried along the stream to Gagapeng and to other towns, and were pulled laboriously back, laden with cargo each way. It was not hard to find a boatman willing to carry him for a price. All that was required was sufficient coin. His bargain with Slider had provided him with coin, not in abundance, but sufficient, if he spent it carefully. He had few skills save magic, with which to earn anything more on his journey, and using magic before he'd gotten out of Saljashanite territory, well out of it, would be dangerous foolishness. Allison was uncomfortable. Not physically uncomfortable, but socially uncomfortable. Back in Strixbold, she'd been a guest, but had been able, if only in a semi-skilled manner, to help Morelai. Here she was a guest once more, but a guest on the level of her hosts, leaving her nothing useful to do. She had no ability to use magic, and botany here was highly developed. Most of the magic had to do with causing plants to grow in some specialized manner, producing some particular seed, sap, blossom, stalk, or whatever. I'm sort of like a computer specialist of 1980 being jumped into the year 2000 without having had the chance to live through all the progress between. I know a whole lot of theory, but almost none of the practical applications. I can't even read the language, she thought to herself. She looked down at the book in front of her. She had been working at remedying her lack of literacy. The writing system, unfortunately, had been developed for some language of long ago, and no longer exactly represented the sound system of present-day Rosthanite. It was a bit like a Turk, used to the alphabet developed for Turkish, trying to learn to read English. Even worse, since the alphabets of the local alphabet bore no relation, of course, to the Latin alphabet. So many of the letters had different pronunciations, depending on what letters went with them, and sometimes apparently for no discernible reason. That meant that words had to be memorized, though she had to admit there were a few general rules about pronunciation. She had to depend on Royan to explain things to her, which was made worse by the fact that he was, apparently, in charge of the whole household clan, and was very busy dealing with the ramifications and results of the late Grandmaster's actions. She wasn't about to take advantage of her status as a guest by insisting that he help her with every little thing that came up. A royal deputation had searched the house from top to bottom to ensure that Pengua House had suffered as badly as any from the cataclysm, and this was not some sneaky trick to destroy the other households, leaving Pengua supreme. She'd been introduced to the deputation as a person from a far land, here to advise on botanical matters, but in fact she knew very well she was useless. One of the younger men, who were termed baby magicians, took Allison for a tour of the household. She was almost certain he'd done it under instructions from Royan, and her mood varied from, "Am I supposed to remember all this?" to, "What are they hiding from me?" Every time she found herself thinking this second, she tried to force herself to believe that they had no ill intent toward her, despite the fact they had insisted she was here for good. She tried not to think about that fact, if it were a fact, too long or too hard. It became too easy to miss things back home, to work her way into a depression, brooding on the notion she'd never see home again. Just a minute, what's behind this door here? Oh, that's just the garbage room. Nothing interesting in there. But that brought to mind Morelai's comment on how the city people handled their sewage. Besides that, it was one way of asserting herself, of not just accepting explanations people here gave to her. "I'd like to have a look." His expression was mainly exasperation, but he opened the door. She wasn't sure what she expected. Perhaps a bunch of flashing lights and extremely magical looking things, but there's nothing like that here. It looked like a swamp more than anything, with bushes of smaller and larger sorts growing in it, as well as smaller plants and grasses. It was open to the sky, allowing the plants to get all the sun they needed, save round the sides where the walls sheltered it. The scent was mostly flowers, though if she tried hard, she could catch a faint whiff of human waste. The plants do it all, then? Yes, of course, the Allison lady. All the plants here have been bred to take their part in reclaiming waste. The masters have also seen fit to include a low-grade spell to subdue the worst of the smell. That is fascinating. This place? All it does is take waste and grow on it. Every once in a while we have people go through and clip back the branches, and then compost them for the gardens. She gave him a look. You have any idea how many cities have no way of dealing with their waste but throwing it out the window and hoping the rain will wash it away? He shrugged. Maybe in Saljashan, but not in Rostan. I passed through a little place in the Newlands where they didn't have this stuff. She waved a hand at the room full of plants. He shrugged again. The Newlands, well, yes, they couldn't afford it just yet. A lot of them may not even know it's possible. She was on the edge of talking about the necessity of taking care of waste so as not to cause disease, but she held back. Rostan was ruled over by a king whose only care about the farmers in the outback was that they pay their taxes on time. He might possibly be led to see that a healthy populace would mean more taxes, but he would also likely see as a bad idea anything that required him to spend money, with the result seen only in the long term. For crying out loud, they still considered diseases to be caused by noxious vapors. How likely was it a person from a strange place, and a woman to boot, could convince them that noxious vapors could be dealt with? We can't wait any longer, Hadjalani said. Hadjalani was quiet but determined. We have people hunting Malungtal, but it's nowhere near certain we can get him before he gets to Rostan. We can't allow them any time to make preparations against us. I know that all the wizardly households have been rendered ineffectual, but I still wouldn't bet against them being able to manage something. If only some kind of last-minute counterattack. Yes, sir. The man who had taken Malungtal's place was a competent enough wizard, and had extreme respect for the authority of the Watchers. There will be no problems? Well, no, sir. Hadjalani did not like the hesitation. Something disturbs you? No, sir. Good. See to it. It's time the life twisters of Rostan were put down. Yes, sir. Captain Yonoma's message was clear and annoying. There were a few traces of him at Goral on the Sarad, but too few for any real tracking. We're certain that he took a passage on a boat. No one recalls anyone of his description, but he was surely wearing some sort of magic disguise. I'm continuing to follow. Hadjalani scowled at the paper. Yonoma was obviously an incompetent, likely only pretending to follow the trail. When he finally came home, he'd be listed as suspect. The training is going as well as could be expected, though not as well as we'd like. I don't think it's possible to do as well as we'd like. 2 of the older students have passed and qualified as junior masters, on the understanding that they spend a good deal of each day studying. Ormant looked up from the paper in front of him and went on. We now have 3 men and 2 women recruited from the marketplace. We're starting to get people coming to the door and asking to be taken on. Depending on how far down we let our standards go, we can probably get a few more. Any problem working the recruits into our household? Ormant's face twitched into a near smile. The biggest trouble is teaching them household manners. We haven't been able to let them back out on the streets yet. Our reputation is still low, and having someone out there wearing our colors and acting like street drags isn't a good idea. Roya nodded. from all I hear, our reputation is getting worse. Unless something good happens or something bad happens to take their minds off us, in a few days we're going to see our servants stoned in the marketplaces. He laid a hand on the table. The Ascension Day gift is going to be less than spectacular this year. We have a young woman able to describe all sorts of strange and wonderful plants, but we have just about nobody really to do anything about it. I'm going to make a try, produce something, but I don't know if our royal master will be impressed. Has she understood she's never going to be able to go home again? Ryan shrugged. I don't know. She's been told the situation. She seems to understand, but I'm not certain. What was old Tangrel thinking anyway? Ryan shook his head. That anyone, anywhere, would be happy to serve as part one of his plans? I'm becoming less and less impressed with our late Grand Master. I have a feeling he wasn't operating with all his faculties. I wonder if we ought to have some system in place to let us remove a Grand Master if he shows signs of instability. Then you'd have all the masters spending their time politicking rather than working. True. Well, I'll give some thought to the matter anyhow. Ryan did his best to visit Allison every day, sometimes for a long while. Sometimes for just a brief moment, snatched between all the other calls on his time. In the longer visits, much of his time was spent explaining his society. Blood feud? Not in the cities. It still happens from time to time in the smaller communities farther from the capital, despite the king's edicts. The new land? Well, that's far enough from Gagaping that the king is satisfied to be able to collect taxes, and it costs too much to keep garrisons out there to make sure all his decrees were followed. I see, she said. Listen, about this business of adapting plants, how does it work? You can't just take any plant and magic it to do what you want it to. Or can you? He shook his head. It has to be done in stages. You take a plant, in most cases one that already has a tendency to produce what you want, then you spell it to nudge it toward what you want. On a very few occasions, you can get exactly what you want the first time. Mostly, though, you have to successfully nudge each generation for several generations. Once you've got what you want, the next thing is to get it to breed true. So, you need something from me to make a spectacular plant for the king, but you have to get it within the next few weeks? How can you possibly manage all the generations until you've got something that breeds true? That's another part of the magic. You can press the plant into growing from seed to maturity in a very quick time. You lose a lot that way, of course. Each generation pushed through will have at least 10 in 100 samples that have problems ranging from stunting to total throwback to the original version to dying at the leaflet stage, and half a dozen other problems. Can you do the same thing with animals? Plants are easier to work with. With animals, any significant hastening of the growth is likely to cause malformations. That means a longer time before you can get to the stage of breeding true. And before you ask, working with humans is forbidden. I don't mean that no one ever does it, but if they're caught, they're punished. There's quite a trade in spelling children in the womb to come out healthier, stronger, and so on. Some of the people casting spells aren't even charlatans, and some of them have success. It's frowned on, though. If there's a stillbirth or a deformed child born in the upper levels of society, it's likely that someone's spell went awry. You can also hear stories of an occasional wizard in the lower quarters being lynched. Chances are he was accused, rightly or wrongly, of messing up the spells on someone's child. The nobles aren't so vindictive? Oh, they are. Their vindictiveness usually takes the form of a quiet killing, though. Back to the Ascension Day gift. What happens if you don't have something ready for that? Oh, there's always something we can use for an Ascension Day gift. It's just it may not be as flashy as we could desire. I have a feeling that nothing we can do this year is going to meet with the king's unalloyed approval. Not with what Tangrel's done to us. He realized what he'd said. That isn't for repeating to anyone else. It's one of those things that pretty well everyone knows, but if someone says it out loud, people have to take notice. You needn't worry. You've been keeping me away from anyone outside the house. He could hear the bitterness in her tone. He wished there was some sort of magic to give her a complete comprehension of the situation. It's very touchy. If it comes out that Tangrel had successfully brought you from an outside world, there'd be enormous pressure on the house. It would put you in personal danger, too. The king would see you as something strange, something he didn't understand. He wouldn't know for sure whether or not you presented a danger to him or in his kingdom, so the most likely thing he'd do is have you killed. Really? He could hear a tinge of disbelief in her voice. For all the experience she'd already had in this world, Sanat's toenails. She'd barely gotten away from Strick's bulg before her best friend had come to the end of her ability to protect her guest from death in revenge for a self-defense killing. Really, the only protection you have here is Pangua household and its reputation. Tangle has ripped the household and its reputation to shreds. I've been dealing with matters as though that weren't the case, and trying to rush the building up of our strength, our wizardly manpower. But if the king takes the notion to push us, though, we'll likely fall apart. I see. He thought she did see, at least to some degree. The household servants weren't that good actors, and something of the household situation must be coming through to her. I'd appreciate if you could stay quiet and accept that your situation coincides with ours, or at the very least, that it coincides with ours better than to anyone else's in this world. He could see he was pressing her too far, and cursed himself for a fool. All right, she said. But he had a feeling that her agreement would only last as long as it took her to discover some way that seemed to suit her better. For her part, Allison had some reservations. There wasn't a wizard left in Gagapeng. There wasn't a wizard left in Gagapeng with the power to send her home? Well, that was Royan's story, and everyone she met agreed with it, except that she had met no one save those under Royan's authority. She paused. Now that thought could lead in several directions. Why would Royan want her under such a delusion? Of course, she only knew bits and pieces of the society, this city. She knew the subtleties, traditions, and drives of the villages of Strick's Bulg better than those of Gagapeng. And she had to admit that she only knew a fraction of the things a teenager of the village grew up knowing. Might she just be too suspicious? Not that she had no reason for suspicion. Look at Strick's Bulg. She thought it should go along quite well. Then all of a sudden she was the focus of a blood feud. What didn't she know about Gagapeng? She opened up one of the books she'd been using for reading practice. She'd memorized the alphabet long ago, all 33 letters. The big problem was working out how the letters were pronounced when they were put together. She could do a lot with context, of course, and was getting better at that. Despite that, she was constantly making lists of words that she needed. She was making lists of words that she needed someone to pronounce for her. Most of the servants were functionally illiterate. She was allowed to talk with one of the older students, most of whom were helpful, save for a snobbish few who seemed to feel that if a person of her age hadn't already learned to read, they obviously lacked the intelligence. For those sort, the fact that she had no magical ability at all only made matters worse. She never complained, but one thing she had to say in Royan's favor. He somehow found out about these things, and the worst offenders were sent to apologize. That, of course, just made them less willing to have anything to do with her, but at least they weren't actively sabotaging her efforts. There were some of the usual student-type jokes, such as this morning, young Haldum had tried to tell her that the word she was just asking about was the word for excrement. The first part of the word could possibly give that sort of pronunciation, but the pronunciation of the second half would have required the violation of several rules. The exception written through the rules were, she called him on it. Are you sure? Anyway, we handled them. Those last two gives us one too many syllables. His square young face attempted to radiate assurance. No, this was one of the words where the rules change. This eot here, it goes silent. She fixed him with a look. What happens when I use the word as Royan and tell him where I got the meaning from? A more accomplished jokester would have assured her that he was right and would have put together some kind of explanation for Royan later. Hallam was not quite that secure. All right then, it means historian. Almost had you though. Not even close, Hallam. There had been an occasion early on when she had nearly been taken in, but a snicker on the part of the student had given the game away. She never told Royan about any of these incidents, of course. She could have, but she wasn't going to have him fighting her battles for her. She considered the books made available to her. In light of her suspicions, actually, they had given her access to everything in the library. She'd wanted it, though the librarians had noted that certain works were probably too abstruse for beginners. Just to be sure, she checked some of these books. Abstruse? Like a junior high student attempting to work their way through Newton's Principia Mathematica, rendered into suitably obscure English. On the other hand, she couldn't read well enough to make out the system by which the library catalogued its works, and they needn't go to any great trouble to hide things from her. Not right now, at least. Given the size of the collection, she could hardly believe they'd called the library of all works that might tell her things they'd rather not have her know. She concentrated on the suggested books, at least for now, and occasionally wondered if her background and the things she'd already had happen to her in this world were making her too suspicious of everyone. The boatman's wife had a small baby who seemed to spend most of the night and day crying. In the confines of a riverboat, there was nowhere one could get away from the sound. Malungto told himself he ought to have been more particular in taking passage on a boat, but word had been going around the town of Gorel on the Sarad that they were expecting a special deputation of watchers. He wasn't sure that they were after him. He wasn't sure if they were after him in particular, but good sense told him they were. He hadn't thought to ask the boatman important questions, though, like, does your wife have a child who cries incessantly? After a few days, he was less forgiving of himself over that lapse. On and on they went along the long grey river, with the crew occasionally adding a push from their long poles to the speed of the current, always on the lookout for rocks, sandbars, logs swept down from higher reaches of the river, and other such obstructions. And the baby continued to cry. If you want my opinion, Allison said, that's one of the most pitiful roses in existence. The smile Royan gave her held a trace of embarrassment. Perhaps so, but it's the only rose in existence in Rosthan. That being so, there's nothing to compare it to. I think, rather than spend another week trying to improve on it, we should put a spell of preservation on it and present it to the king. The scent is right, is it? Oh yes, the scent is right. Perhaps a little intense, but it should do. She paused. Sorry, I can't seem to say anything good about anything without putting in a dig. He shrugged. If I'd been taken out of my own world and put into another where I had no proper skills to support myself, no family to help me, and put in the danger of death as well, I suppose I'd be feeling upset at everything too. She was very close at snapping at him not to be so darned understanding, but she held her tongue in check. Okay. that was chapter 6. That was all for tonight. Have a good night, and thanks for tuning in.